Just a quick one. Just a quick little read today. So let's just get into it. That in brief is the sum of the argument of the problemata. It is clear that if Hegel is right, then Abraham does teleologically suspend the ethical. He does conceive of an absolute duty to God, and he remained concealed. He cannot justify his actions to those concerned. But what is Johannes de Salento's own view? Does he side with Abraham, or should we rather interpret the problemata in a minimal fashion? That is, should we say that all that Jonas is doing is to show that if you are Hegelian, then you cannot talk glibly of faith as something that you have fathomed and can proceed beyond, because according to your principle, Abraham is morally evil and a criminal. The minimal answer leaves open, however, the question of whether Jonas envisions some alternative principle for morality. I myself believe he does, but it is one thing to envision an oh my God, I haven't read in so long. An alternative in the sense simply of not excluding the possibility that there is one, another to envision. It is, so to speak, present to mind. I would suggest that where Kierkegaard might say that he himself envisioned it in the second sense, Jonas de Salento is made to write as if he envisioned it only in the first. The story of Abraham and Isaac indicates only in outline, and by symbolizing its formal features, the view that is possible for someone to qualify as essentially human independently of any specification one may give of what, in the context of intention and action, is properly human in general. This would be unthinkable to Hegelians. They would assume as matter of principle that there is an inseparable link between acquiring the status of a developed human being, and conforming ever more successfully to and convergently upon some accepted general specification of human. What they would never be able to understand as Abraham is that for him it is not any revealed balance of human gain in respect of the total social life of a community that counts for the humanity of an action. Abraham acts as though someone could be properly human prior to the expression of his or her humanity in the universal, so that the universal becomes an expression in turn of humanity pre-established, as it were, at the level of particular, and no longer the category in which humanity is established. Oh my God. I'm so tired already, man. I haven't done anything. I haven't done anything today, man. Where Hegelians believe individuals realize themselves by being taken up, consciously and willingly, in the universal, Abraham represents a diametrical opposite view in which the universal or the presence of a social intention has first to be established prior to entering the universal. Its being formed in the individual is, so Kierkegaard believed his own experience to have taught him, no easy matter. In the end, it requires faith, in the sense that Jonas de Salento is made to clarify. However, Jonas's platform is still that of his readers. The postulate that the ethical is the universal is one that he accepts, at least as the only going ethical principle available to him, and he uses it to test the distance between his sense of greatness of Abraham and his ability to understand him. Really, what he uncovers is the extent of the inability of those who accept the Hegelian principle to understand Abraham. But that is because the readers Kierkegaard has designed him for are wedded to the principle. Kierkegaard's overriding aim is to divorce them from it, and he believes that he has to be done with their own consent, and therefore with due regard to their own conceptual and attitudinal presuppositions. In a work published after his death, Kierkegaard gives some guidelines as to how he interprets his aesthetic and dialectical works. He says the former are to lead the reader to Christian concepts back from the aesthetic way of interpreting them, back from the point of view of life of immediacy, and the later back from the system and speculative philosophy. In the case of the aesthetic works, his method, he says, is to deceive in answer to his own question about what the deception amounts to. In this case, he says, it means that one doesn't begin directly. Oh my God. I'm so sorry, everybody. It means that one doesn't begin directly with with what one wants to communicate, but going along with the other's delusion. Thus, one begins by saying, not I am a Christian, you are not, but you are a Christian, I am not. Not by saying it is Christianity I preach and the life you lead is purely aesthetic, but by saying let's talk about the aesthetic. The deception is that one does this precisely in order to come to the religious. But according to the assumption, the other is also under the delusion that the aesthetic is the Christian, since he thinks he is a Christian and yet lives the life of immediacy. At one point in Fear and Trembling, where Jonas de Salento says he doesn't understand Abraham, he also says that to understand him, we need a new category. This is almost certainly the Christian concept of faith, defined and elaborated at great length in philosophical fragments, and particularly concluding unscientific postscript. Actually, the concept of faith developed where there helps us in no way to understand Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as a trial. What it does is provide the basis for the alternative ethical paradigm, which Jonas de Salento is only able to chart by banging his head up against the limbs of the Hegelian paradigm. That is what it is his job as a pseudonymous author to do. Jonas de Salento operates dialectically, but only from the perspective of people who live the life of immediacy. They don't have the Christian concept of faith, and nor does he. The new paradigm is reserved for later pseudonyms who take on Hegel's system more directly, and whose readers are people who need to be brought back from that. They too are deluded, they are absent minded, because they have allowed themselves to be so much swallowed up in the system that they have lost sight of what it means to exist, of the sense of being particular, and in the process have given intellectual support to be prevailing pantheistically dissolute contempt for individual people. They have to be humored out of their delusion, but that is another story. Introductions to the work of Kierkegaard's usually begin with a summary of his life. I have chosen to put that summary at the end. The reason is that if one puts too much emphasis on the points of biographical relevance that keep from cropping up, particularly in the so-called aesthetics works, one loses sight of the compositional integrity of the best of Kierkegaard's writings. This is undoubtedly true of Fear and Trembling, in which almost every page, certainly every illustration, from myth, folktale, history, or Kierkegaard's own imagination bears witness to its actual author's real-life preoccupations at the time. The work appeared when Soren Kierkegaard was 30. It came 8 months after the publication of his first main and much larger work, Either or, A Fragment of Life, and thus marks the beginning of a period of intense activity that saw more than a dozen major publications by the year 1850. The background can be briefly sketched. Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen on May 5th, 1813. His father's family had worked the land of their local priests in Jutland in a feudal arrangement that gave them their name. The father himself had been released from his virtual vassalage by the priest at the age of 21, and at the time when he had already moved to Copenhagen to work in an uncle's hosiery business. Kierkegaard Sr. later became a wealthy wholesaler of imported goods, and Soren inherited a fair fortune from his father. Soren was the youngest of 7 children, whose mother and father's second wife. Wait, Soren was the youngest of 7 children whose mother was their father's second wife and had formerly been a maid to the first. A brother and sister died before he was 9. His 2 surviving sisters, a brother and a mother, all died not long before he was 21, and Soren became convinced that he himself would not live than more than 33 years old. He was educated at a strictly run school of civic virtue, gained there by a reputation for quick tongue and sharp wit, and then at the university where he enrolled in 1830, his chosen subject was theology, but he studied liberal arts and science as well, spending in all 7 years as a student, his father footing the not inconsiderable bills. In 1837, he met Regine Olsen, daughter of a Copenhagen dignitary. Oh. Regine was then 14 years old, and following the year Kierkegaard's father died, the father had exercised a great and largely oppressive influence on the son from an early childhood, and Kierkegaard eventually found it necessary to try to recapture his spontaneity by breaking himself free. In 1835, he had begun describing Christianity associated with his father as a debilitating influence. He looked about him for another idea to live or die for, forsook his studies, and led outwardly the life of a rich young man about town, aesthetic, and wit. Entries in his normal journal, however, tell a very different story. Kierkegaard was really undergoing a period of deep depression, which nevertheless culminated in a recollection with his father shortly before the latter death at the age of 81. Then came the affair with Regine. They became engaged on September 10th, 1840, and it all seemed set for a life of civic virtue. But that was not to be. Although in the year following the betrothal, he had undergone the necessary practice training for a career in the state church, and possibly with an academic career in mind, he began to work at the doctoral thesis, and had even preached his first sermon in August of 1841. He returned to Regine's engagement ring. By November of that year, not long after his successful defense of that thesis, the break with Regine was final, and he was on his way to Berlin, attending Schirling's lectures. The reasons for this turn of events are not easy to pinpoint, but the crux seems to have been Kierkegaard's sense of his inability to fulfill personal conditions of a civic life, in particular those involved in being husband and father. Whatever the reasons, there followed the flood of pseudonyms and non-pseudonym works, beginning in February 1843 with Either Or, followed by the repetition and Fear and Trembling, and 8 months subsequently by these philosophical fragments and the concept of anxiety. These were relatively slim volumes, but then came the substantial stages of life's ways, followed by the dialectical concluding unscientific postscripts to the philosophical fragments, directed by philosophers of the Hegelian tradition. Alongside this already impressive production, Kierkegaard also published 21 edifying and Christian disclosures under his own name. Fear and Trembling belongs to a series of works concerned with the realizing the universal, a theme close to Kierkegaard's heart in view of his decision not to proceed with his marriage. But in Fear and Trembling, this theme is set in sharp juxtaposition with two others, faith and sacrifice. The relevance of the latter and thus also appeal to Kierkegaard. Also, Kierkegaard of the story of Abraham and Isaac is obvious enough. In one respect, Kierkegaard was sacrificing Regine, who obviously wanted the marriage. In another, he was sacrificing himself, since he obviously wanted Regine, and in yet another, he perhaps felt that his whole life had been sacrificed through his father, at least ruined as far as being healthily adapted in the mind as well as body to accepting the responsibilities and pleasures of a family life and a solid job is concerned, and therefore a preparation for some higher mission. As an expert psychologist, Kierkegaard was well able to sort out these possible constructions of a situation for himself, and to question the corresponding motives, as well as his own motives for adopting any of them. Thus, to think that the pain he caused Regine as a sacrifice to a higher mission, the pain his father had caused him, had somehow prepared him, and maybe even specifically him, to carry out, could well be a strategy to conceal some less worthy motive. The way in which he thought of handling the break with Regine was repeated in the final version he constructs of the legend of Agnant and the Merman. So too with faith. In his journals he wrote that if he had faith for this life, he would have stayed with Regine. But that too would have required sacrifice, at least of his career as a writer, and with all that his life had seemed to be in preparation for. Shoot. Okay, this is the last page of the intro. Oh my god, dang it, man. I have work in 30 minutes. Shoot, man. It was, in any case, the career of a writer that he pursued until his death at the age of 42. By that time, he had managed to make himself an object of public ridicule by provoking a feud with a satiric weekly which mercilessly castrated him, or whatever I said. His posture, clothes, and the unusual jerky gait, but also a public nuisance by launching a sustained and bitter attack on the Danish state church and its more eminent functionaries. These were further publications, notably Sickness unto Death and Practicing Christianity, and a number of Christian discourses, and a broadsheet with Kierkegaard himself published called The Instant. This ran through 9 issues before Kierkegaard fell ill, collapsed in the street, and died in a hospital some 6 weeks later, probably a lung infection. On his sickbed, he confided to his friend from boyhood, one Emil Bozen, now a pastor, and the only member of the church he would see, even though his own brother was a clergyman, that his life had been a great and to others unknown and incomprehensible suffering, which looked like pride and vanity, but wasn't. He regretted that hadn't been married or taken on an official position. Kierkegaard's funeral was the occasion of a minor disturbance led by his student nephew, who protested at the church's insistence on officiating at the committal proceedings, contrary to the deceased's wishes. In the preface to Fear and Trembling, the author sports with the notion of going further in expression. I also used at the beginning of this introduction. It was used by H.L. Martensen, Kierkegaard's former tutor at Copenhagen University, and later bishop primate, in a review where he claimed that one should move forward from the methodological doubt of Descartes, yeah, to Hegel and even beyond. Kierkegaard uses doubt as a parallel to faith, as something hard enough to get to, let alone to further them. This is the typical of the situational character of most of Kierkegaard's writings. They were written for contemporary readers who, unlike us, would be quick to catch the allusions and identify the references. He wrote in Danish, of course, and could have entertained no exception that his work would no expectation that his work would become a classic. However, concerning Fear and Trembling, he did predict that with its frightful pathos, this early work alone would suffice to immortalize my name as an author. Moreover, once C. was dead, and his reputation for flippancy and wit no longer prevented readers from taking his book seriously, it would be read but also be translated into other languages. And then now we're on to the actual book. A lyric by Jonas de Salento, Fear and Trembling. Yay! Oh man, maybe I should just take like a 5-minute power nap before work. I think that's what I'm gonna do. All right, bye bye everybody.